The hum of the luxury hotel was the backdrop to Clara's exhaustion, a life split between serving the rich and her nursing studies. On her wrist, a silver bracelet with a single intricate key charm. It was priceless to her and worthless to anyone else, or so she believed. Tonight, Margaret Blackwood, a woman forged from steel and old money, would sit at her table. She would grab Clara's wrist, her eyes wide with a shock so profound it would begin to unravel a dark family secret and reveal a truth far more shocking than death. Before we start the story, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can meet again. The opulent and gilded dining room of the Monarch Hotel was a world Clara only inhabited on the fringes. By day, she was a dedicated nursing student, her mind saturated with anatomical charts and pharmacological terms. By night, she was an almost invisible cog in this machine of hushed luxury. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and rich sauces, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell of the hospital wards she'd left just 2 hours ago. Her feet throbbed in her sensible black shoes, a dull ache that had become her constant companion during these grueling double shifts. She remained professional, her face a mask of serene focus, but beneath it, she was stressed and utterly exhausted. The juggling act of her 2 lives was wearing thin. A looming tuition payment felt like a physical weight on her shoulders. She navigated between tables laden with gleaming silverware, her tray held high, a practiced grace belying the tremor of fatigue in her arms. She could hear the low murmur of conversations, discussions of stock portfolios and summer travel, a language from a planet she could never hope to visit. Her gaze flickered to the hostess stand. Only 3 more tables were seated in her section. Just 3 more tables. She whispered to herself, the thought, a desperate mantra, and I can finally pay for my heavy textbooks. The relief was so brief, it was almost painful. Her co-worker Anna brushed past, offering a tight, sympathetic smile. Clara nodded back, her free hand instinctively finding the familiar comfort of the silver charm bracelet on her left wrist. Her fingers sought the single, intricate, old key charm. It was a nervous habit, a way to anchor herself when the pressure of her dual existence threatened to pull her under. It was the only thing her mother had left her. This small piece of metal was her only real connection to a past she barely understood, and a stark reminder of how truly alone she was in this glittering, indifferent world. Just as Clara was catching her breath by the service station, her manager, Mr. Girard, intercepted her. His usually composed face was uncharacteristically tight, with a palpable anxiety. "Clara," he said, his voice a hushed, urgent whisper that cut through the restaurant's low hum. "Table 9, the Blackwoods." Clara felt a small, cold knot form in her stomach. The Blackwoods were not just guests. They were hotel royalty, the shipping dynasty that practically owned the city block, and Margaret Blackwood was its undisputed queen. "Mrs. Blackwood is our most important guest," Mr. Girard continued, his eyes wide to impress the gravity of the situation upon her. "I cannot stress this enough. Do not make a single mistake. Understood?" Clara could only nod, her professionalism a thin veneer over a sudden spike of raw intimidation. She smoothed her black apron, her hands slightly damp, took a deep, steadying breath, and picked up the heavy, ornate, silver water pitcher. Table 9 was the best in the entire restaurant, a plush, secluded corner booth, upholstered in deep velvet that functioned as a silent, imposing enclave of quiet power. The very air around it seemed stiffer, more formal, and significantly colder than the rest of the bustling dining room. As she approached, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet, she saw them. Margaret Blackwood was exactly as her formidable reputation described. A matriarch with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe, perfect bun, and a cold-eyed, assessing gaze that seemed to absorb all the warmth from the room. She was studying the menu as if it had personally offended her. Beside her sat her son, Julian Blackwood, the company's polished and handsome CEO. He was the picture of effortless charm, though his expensive suit seemed more like armor. He offered Clara a brief, practiced smile as she approached. "Good evening," Clara began, keeping her voice perfectly level and low. "Welcome. May I offer you some water this evening?" Julian's smile was blinding, but, as Clara noted, it did not reach his eyes in the slightest. "That would be lovely, thank you," he replied, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. Margaret, however, did not even look up from her menu. She merely gave a short, impatient, dismissive wave of her hand, a gesture that clearly indicated Clara was less than the air she was breathing. Clara moved with practiced, steady hands, her entire focus on the task. She leaned forward, holding the heavy silver pitcher, to pour Margaret's water. As she extended her arm, the cuff of her crisp white uniform shirt, starched but slightly frayed from countless washings, rode up her forearm by just an inch. It was a tiny, insignificant movement, but it was enough. For a single, fatal second, the silver charm bracelet on her left wrist was exposed. It slid free, catching the soft, ambient light of the overhead chandelier. The single, intricate key charm, worn smooth with time, dangled and spun, its unique, almost archaic design glinting. It was in that exact second that Margaret Blackwood finally looked up, not at Clara, but at her hand. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. The formidable matriarch's cold facade did not just crack. It shattered like a sheet of ice struck by a hammer. Her eyes, moments ago so dismissive, locked onto the small silver key with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. A sharp, choked gasp, almost a sob, escaped her throat, a sound so raw and out of place in the elegant dining room that it was shocking. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a waxy, pale color. Her perfectly manicured hand, adorned with a heavy gold ring, began to tremble, the vibration starting in her fingertips and quickly spreading up her arm. Julian, in the middle of a sentence about a shipping merger, stopped abruptly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The clinking of silverware from nearby tables suddenly seemed to fade. All sound, all life, seemed to drain from their small, isolated corner of the restaurant. The air grew heavy and tight, charged with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Clara, alarmed by the gasp, froze, the pitcher still in her hand. She looked from the old woman's pale, shocked face to Julian, whose own expression was one of sudden, cold alarm. He looked at his mother, his eyes narrowing. "Mother?" Julian asked, his smooth voice suddenly laced with a sharp, warning edge. "Is the wine not to your liking?" But Margaret didn't hear him. She couldn't. Her entire universe had just shrunk to the size of that small silver key dangling from the waitress's wrist. Before Julian could utter another word, before Clara could even process the old woman's distress, Margaret's hand darted out. It was not the frail movement of an elderly woman. It was a sudden, shocking, and violent action, fast as a snake's strike. Her fingers, strong as a steel trap, clamped down on Clara's wrist with a bruising, painful force. The heavy silver water pitcher wobbled dangerously in Clara's other hand. She let out a small, frightened gasp, the sound swallowed by the sudden, profound hush that fell over the nearby tables. Diners paused, forks halfway to their mouths, their quiet, murmuring conversations cut short as they turned their full attention to look at the disturbance. Margaret's face was inches from Clara's hand. Her eyes, no longer cold, were wide and blazing with a raw, visceral emotion, a mixture of disbelief and profound, agonizing grief. "That key," she whispered, and the sound was a hoarse, trembling rasp that tore through the silence. "It's impossible." Clara was frozen, a surge of adrenaline and pure fear rooting her to the spot. She tried to pull away, a small, instinctual tug, but the old woman's grip was unyielding. Julian was instantly alarmed. His charming, practiced mask evaporated, replaced by a look of sharp, cold panic. "Mother, let go," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. But Margaret ignored him, her entire being focused on the small piece of silver. Her eyes welled with tears, a sight so unexpected it was like watching a statue weep. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice cracking, her grip tightening painfully. Only 2 were made, 2. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara, terrified, could only stare at the woman who was crushing her wrist, her mind racing, unable to comprehend what was happening. The sudden, intense violation made her feel dizzy, her carefully managed composure shattering completely. The elegant dining room had just become a terrifying public spectacle, and she was at its epicenter, held captive by a billionaire's impossible, desperate question. Julian's reaction was as fast and smooth as his mother's had been violent. In a single, fluid motion, he placed his own hands over Margaret's, his voice a low, controlling murmur. "Mother, that's enough. Let go of her." He exerted gentle but firm pressure, prying her steel-like fingers from Clara's arm, one by one. Simultaneously, he made an almost imperceptible signal to Mr. Gerard, who was already rushing toward the table, his face a mask of pure panic. Clara stumbled back, cradling her throbbing red wrist, her whole body shaking with a mixture of humiliation and fear. The entire restaurant was watching her. Margaret seemed to deflate, the fiery intensity in her eyes replaced by a dazed, vacant look. She stared at the empty space where Clara's wrist had been, whispering a single name, so low it was almost inaudible. Amelia. Julian, now in full control, rose partially from his seat, a perfect, concerned smile plastered on his face as he addressed the fawning manager. "My apologies, Mr. Gerard," Julian said, his voice carrying just enough to calm the nearby tables. "My mother is unwell. A momentary lapse, I'm afraid. The long day has been too much for her. He was the very picture of a devoted, caring son. Please, just send the bill to my office." He then turned his gaze on Clara. It was only for a second, but his eyes, no longer charming, were cold, assessing, and held a clear, silent warning. Mr. Gerard, profusely apologetic to the Blackwoods, shot a venomous glare at Clara, as if the entire, mortifying public spectacle were her fault. Julian had expertly and chillingly diffused the entire situation in under a minute, painting his mother as a fragile victim and Clara as an unfortunate and now very problematic irrelevance. Clara was dismissed from her shift early, a mercy from Mr. Gerard that felt more like a punishment. She was walking quickly, almost running, through the sterile, quiet service corridor, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, making the white-tiled walls seem even more clinical and threatening. She just wanted to get home, to escape the stares and whispers. "Miss Clara." The voice was not a request, it was a command, low and urgent, and it stopped her cold. Julian Blackwood stepped out from a recessed doorway, his face no longer holding any trace of its earlier, practiced charm. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the stark hallway, and his eyes were cold and clinical. "My mother is a fragile woman," he said, his voice smooth but utterly devoid of warmth. "She is haunted by the past. That trinket on your wrist is a painful coincidence." Clara found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "It was my mother's." Julian's smile was a thin, humorless line, a touching story, but her emotional distress is inconvenient. "So, here is what will happen." He took a step closer. "I will pay for your entire nursing school tuition. All of it. I will also provide a substantial relocation bonus. Enough to start a new life far from here." He paused, letting the offer hang in the silken, threatening air. "You will accept this. You will give me that bracelet, and you will leave the city. Tonight, this conversation never happened. Do you understand me?" The generous, life-changing offer felt less like a gift and more like a silken threat. Clara stood there, intimidated but a spark of defiance growing, clutching the wrist that still throbbed from his mother's grip. The number he had just offered was life-changing. It was the end of her double life, the end of her exhaustion. It was a clean, easy future. But the offer, delivered in this cold, sterile hallway, felt dirty. It was a buy-off. It was not an act of kindness for a fragile mother. It was a calculated move by a man desperate to bury a problem. Clara's fear, which had been a cold, paralyzing knot in her stomach, did not disappear. It simply sharpened, transmuting into a cold, clear suspicion. This man wasn't protecting his mother's feelings. He was protecting a secret. He wanted her gone. He wanted the bracelet gone. His urgency was the tell. Clara's hand instinctively tightened around her wrist, the silver key charm digging into her palm. "It's not a trinket," she said, her voice quiet but gaining a sudden steely strength she didn't know she possessed. "It was my mother's, and it's not for sale." The shift in Julian Blackwood was immediate and terrifying. His polished, controlled facade didn't just slip, it fell away completely, revealing the cold, ruthless man beneath. His eyes, moments before just calculating, turned to pure ice. A chilling, predatory stillness came over him. He looked at her, not as a person, but as an obstacle to be removed. "You are making a terrible, terrible mistake," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "A very foolish, very poor girl's mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with. You have no idea what you are stumbling into." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The threat was absolute, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who always got his way. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, his expensive shoes echoing on the tile, leaving Clara alone in the corridor, her heart hammering. The warning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, long after he was gone. Back at the vast, lonely, and silent Blackwood estate, Margaret sat bolt upright in her leather chair in the cavernous study. The room, filled with priceless art and dark, imposing wood, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Sleep was impossible. She was haunted by the encounter. The image of that silver key, spinning on the young waitress's slender wrist, was burned into her mind, a ghost from a life she had buried. But it wasn't just the key, a perfect twin to the one she wore on a chain beneath her silk blouse, that plagued her. It was Julian's reaction, his overly smooth handling of the situation, his practiced, patient tone as he dismissed her as unwell, his insistent, almost condescending focus on her fragility. It had all seemed like the actions of a dutiful son in the restaurant. Now, in the heavy, oppressive silence of her home, it felt fundamentally wrong. It felt rehearsed. It felt chillingly controlling. For 10 long years, she had accepted the official story, a narrative cemented by Julian himself. Her daughter, her wild, rebellious Amelia, had abandoned the family, run off, and died a tragic, squalid death. The grief from that story had calcified her heart, but that girl's quiet defiance and Julian's cold, swift, management of the problem, had planted a new, sharp seed of doubt. He was too fast, she thought, her painted fingernails drumming a silent, angry rhythm on the mahogany desk. Too cold. Julian's eyes, when he'd looked at the girl, hadn't been filled with concern for his mother. They'd been filled with a chilling, calculating anger. "He wasn't protecting me," she whispered to the empty room, the words tasting like poison. He was silencing that girl. The grief that had defined her for a decade was not gone. It was now joined by a sharp, cold, and terribly familiar suspicion. The story of Amelia's death suddenly felt thin. It felt false. The atmosphere in the study, always thick with old grief, was now charged with the electric, terrifying hum of new doubt. The shift was palpable. The grieving, fragile woman Julian so carefully managed was gone, replaced by the cold, formidable matriarch who had built an empire alongside her late husband. The steel in her spine, which grief had only bent, now snapped back into place, rigid and unyielding. Margaret Blackwood ignored the ornate telephone on her desk, the one Julian could monitor, and instead opened a locked drawer. She pulled out a small, secure satellite phone, a device only 2 other people in the world had the number for. She was bypassing Julian. She was bypassing his entire corporate infrastructure. The man who answered on the first ring, Mr. Harrison, was her personal head of security, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient ghost who had served her family for 30 years and answered only to her. Her voice was low, clipped, and absolutely devoid of emotion, the voice she used when hostile takeovers were on the line. "Harrison," she commanded, her gaze fixed on the dark, empty fireplace. "I have a new Priority 1 directive." He said nothing, he only listened. "I want you to track my son's private financial disbursements, all of them. I want to know every dollar he has personally moved for the last 10 years. Specifically, any large, recurring payments to medical facilities, private clinics, or anonymous holding companies. I want names, dates, and locations." She paused, the silence heavy and cold. "You will do this quietly. Julian must not know he is being observed. Understood?" Harrison's quiet affirmation was all she needed. "One more thing," she added, her voice dropping even lower. "Find that waitress from the hotel tonight, the one with the key. I want to know everything about her." She ended the call without saying goodbye. The study, once a tomb of memory, had just become a war room. She was focused, ruthless, and on a mission. Clara fumbled with the locks on her small, cramped apartment door, her hands still shaking from the encounter with Julian Blackwood. The deadbolt, the chain, the knob lock, 3 layers of cheap security that suddenly felt as useless as paper against the kind of power he represented. Her apartment, usually her only sanctuary, felt flimsy, exposed, and terribly unsafe. The single room was cluttered with nursing textbooks, stacks of notes, and the worn, second-hand furniture she had collected over the years. It was a world away from the gilded halls of the Monarch Hotel, a world that could be crushed by Julian Blackwood with a single phone call. His threat echoed in the tiny, silent space. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The terror was cold and sharp, a shard of ice in her stomach. But beneath the fear, something else was growing. A cold, hard anger. He had threatened her. He had tried to buy her, to erase her, and he had wanted the bracelet. He had wanted this one, small piece of her mother. Why? The question pulsed in her mind, a frantic, insistent drumbeat. It could not be a coincidence. It was the only thing that mattered. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a raw, anxious determination. She would not run. She would find answers. She went to the back of her narrow closet, pulling down a small, worn, wooden box from the top shelf. It was the only box that mattered, the one containing the few precious fragments of her mother, Amelia. Inside were a handful of faded photographs, a lock of blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a few brittle, yellowed letters. Clara sank onto her worn rug, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and resolve. She didn't know what she was looking for. She just knew she had to look. She remembered her mother's face, a beautiful, sad face that always seemed to be looking over its shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. She remembered her last clear day with her, just before she vanished. Her mother had knelt, taking Clara's small hands in her own. She had been fastening the silver charm bracelet around her wrist. "This key opens the past, Clara," her mother had whispered, her voice urgent, her eyes wide with an emotion Clara had been too young to understand. "It's the only one. Don't ever lose it. Promise me you'll never, ever lose it." Clara had promised, thinking it was a game, a lovely, secret fairy tale about a magic key. But now, the memory felt chillingly literal. She dug deeper into the box, her fingers brushing against something she had forgotten. Tucked beneath the false bottom her mother must have made, wrapped in a piece of flannel, was a small, thin metal tin. Her breath caught. Inside, there was no jewelry, no money. Just a single folded old dusty receipt, and taped to it a tarnished, ordinary-looking brass key. She unfolded the paper. It was a receipt for a storage unit from a place called Oak Valley Storage, dated over 10 years ago. Then she looked at the key, taped to it. Her blood ran cold. She unclasped the bracelet from her wrist, the silver charm falling into her palm. She held the charm, the intricate, symbolic silver key, next to the tarnished, functional brass key. They were not just similar, they were an exact match. The head, the teeth, the intricate, archaic design. It's the only one. Her mother hadn't been talking about the charm. She had been talking about the design. The brass key was the real, functional version of the charm she wore. The receipt and the key felt heavy, like a stone in her hand, pulsing with purpose and a decade of buried secrets. This was it. This was the first breadcrumb. Julian Blackwood's threat had backfired. He hadn't silenced her. He had just shown her which way to run, straight into the past. Oak Valley Storage was not in a good part of town. It was a run-down, forgotten place, a squat, anonymous building of faded cinder block and rusting, corrugated metal doors, wedged between a tire yard and a defunct warehouse. The taxi driver gave her a long, worried look before pulling away, leaving Clara standing alone in the deserted, cracked parking lot, clutching her bag. Julian Blackwood's threat felt very real here, a tangible presence in the unnerving silence, and she almost turned back. But the image of her mother's lost, sad eyes and the violent, desperate grip of Margaret Blackwood pushed her forward. She found the office, a cramped, dusty room smelling of stale cigarettes and old coffee, where a bored-looking man barely glanced up from his magazine as he pointed her toward the C-block. The hallway was a long, concrete tunnel, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, unsettling shadows and made the air feel green. It was cold, and the air was heavy and still, thick with the unmistakable, musty, subterranean smell of dust, mildew, and a decade of old secrets. Her footsteps, the only sound, seemed deafeningly loud, echoing off the hard, unforgiving surfaces. Unit C-47. The door was a large sheet of metal, its original blue paint chipped and bubbled with angry red rust. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the pulse in her throat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the old brass key steady. It looked impossibly thin and insignificant against the heavy, industrial-grade padlock that secured the door, a lock just as rusted and forgotten as the door itself. She slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a heart-stopping moment, gritty with disuse. Clara held her breath, jiggled it gently, and then, with a sharp, grating click that sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence, the heavy lock sprang open. With all her strength, she pulled the heavy, grinding metal door up, the sound setting her teeth on edge. A wave of even colder, more stagnant air washed over her face, the smell of sealed-in time. Inside, it was dark, a pitch-black tomb. She fumbled for the flashlight on her phone, its thin, bright beam cutting through the absolute gloom. It was a life, frozen in time. A small, dust-covered sofa, a single mismatched chair, a simple wooden dresser, and several sealed cardboard boxes, all huddled together. It looked like it had all been thrown inside in a great, desperate hurry. She stepped in, her feet crunching on the dusty concrete. In the back, tucked inside the top drawer of the dresser, beneath a pile of her own baby clothes she thought were lost forever, she found it. A small, heavy, dark, gray metal safety deposit box. It was cold to the touch, and it was locked. Clara fled the storage facility, the heavy metal box clutched in her tote bag, a dead weight against her hip. She locked the 3 locks on her apartment door, but the small, familiar room no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a flimsy trap, a place Julian Blackwood could find her. His threat had poisoned her only safe space. She placed the box on her small kitchen table, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her hands were trembling violently. "This key opens the past," her mother's voice, a faint, desperate echo in her memory. She looked at her wrist, at the intricate silver charm. It wasn't just a symbol, it was the tool. With fumbling fingers, she unclasped the bracelet, the tiny, symbolic key, worn smooth by a decade of her own anxious touch, fit perfectly into the small, archaic lock on the front of the deposit box. A faint, metallic click, and the heavy lid sprang open. It did not contain money or jewels. It contained a single item, wrapped in a piece of faded flannel, a worn, dark green leather journal. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with secrets. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She opened the cover. On the first page, a name was written in an elegant, looping script that she recognized instantly, a script that had signed her childhood birthday cards. Amelia Blackwood. The name, her mother's true name, hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was real. Her confusion quickly, terrifyingly, gave way to a cold, rising horror as she began to read. The early entries were happy, filled with a fierce, protective love for a baby girl named Clara. But then, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew smaller, more cramped. She wrote of Julian. "Julian is so helpful," one entry read, "but he keeps saying I'm forgetting things. He says I'm confused." A few pages later, the desperation was palpable. "Julian is worried about me. He says I'm not mentally stable. He worries I'll hurt myself or Clara. The gaslighting was laid bare on the page. He's managing my money now. He says it's for the best. He's hired a Dr. Finch, who just watches me. I feel like a prisoner. Then, the final, terrifying entry, dated the day before she vanished. Julian says I'm having a breakdown. He's found a place for me, a private retreat, he calls it, to get well. I'm so afraid. I don't want to go. Clara felt sick, her vision blurring. This wasn't a diary. It was a voice from the grave. It was a testament, a warning from a woman who knew she was being systematically and deliberately erased. Clara felt a wave of profound physical nausea rise from her stomach, the acidic taste of fear and bile in her throat. The journal itself was damning, a chilling, step-by-step account of psychological torture, but it was still just a story. It was her mother's desperate, frantic word against the polished, powerful, and plausible narrative of Julian Blackwood. It was a she-said story against a man who could buy the world's silence. She kept turning the pages, her fingers numb, hoping for something, anything more, but the last desperate entry was followed by a dozen empty, stark white, accusing pages. The silence of those blank pages was a scream, a void where her mother's life had been abruptly cut off. Her hand, still trembling from the shock, brushed against the back cover of the journal. It was thicker than the front. A small, almost invisible flap was sewn into the dark leather lining. It was a hidden pocket. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled to open it, her fingernail catching on the stiff, old leather. Inside, there was a single, thick, folded piece of paper. It was not a letter. It was a high-quality, heavyweight, cream-colored stationery, the kind that screamed, "expensive lawyer." It felt cold and impersonal to the touch. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the dense, formal, impenetrable text, a language of a world she did not understand. But the titles at the top, printed in a severe, bold font, were clear enough. They made her blood run cold, freezing the very air in her lungs. Declaration of Medical Incompetence. Beneath it, a second stapled document. Durable medical power of attorney. Her eyes raced down the page, blurring, skipping past the legal jargon that swam before her. She found the names, the only words that mattered. The patient was listed as Amelia Blackwood, the newly appointed guardian, with full, immediate, and irrevocable control over all medical, financial, and personal decisions, was Julian Blackwood. This was it. This was the weapon. This was the clean, legal, sophisticated knife Julian had used to sever her mother from the world, from her money, from her family, and from her own daughter. It was the tool he used to erase her, to turn a living, breathing woman into a legal ghost. Clara felt sick, a dizzying, spinning sickness that made her grip the edge of the table to stay upright. She looked at the signature at the bottom, the one that made it all official, a sharp, arrogant scrawl. Dr. Alistair Finch. She stared at the date printed next to the signature. It was March 10th, 10 years ago. Her heart stopped. Her mind, in a flash of cold, perfect clarity, flew back to the journal in her other hand. She flipped back to the last, desperate, terrified entry. He's bringing a doctor. I don't trust him. I'm so afraid. The date of that entry, March 9th. The very day after her mother wrote those words, this Dr. Finch, this stranger, had signed her entire life away to the very man she feared. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling Blackwood estate was tomb-like in its silence, but Margaret was wide awake, her study lit only by the green glow of her desk lamp. She was a statue carved from ice and fury, waiting. The satellite phone on her mahogany desk, a ghost of a device, finally vibrated, a silent, urgent pulse in the stillness. She snatched it up before the first buzz had even finished. Harrison. Report. The voice on the other end was, as always, impossibly calm, a flat, emotionless counterpoint to the storm brewing inside her. "You were correct to be suspicious, Mrs. Blackwood." Margaret's knuckles gripping the phone were white. "Get to it. Your son has been moving significant funds. Consistently, for exactly 10 years. A cold, sick dread, deeper than grief, settled in Margaret's stomach. "How much?" "It's not the amount, ma'am, though it is in the millions. It is the source." Harrison paused, a rare, almost dramatic beat. "He has been systematically diverting money from the Blackwood Charitable Fund." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. The charity. The one thing that was her late husband's legacy, his passion, his goodness, preserved. Julian had, for years, been telling her it was underperforming, that its impact was shrinking, that its accounts were complex and best left to him. He had been lying comprehensively for a decade. "To where, Harrison?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "A single recurring recipient. A holding company named Sanctuary Holdings LLC. The payments are substantial, monthly, and falsely categorized within the fund's ledger as long-term palliative care research." "The Sanctuary?" Margaret repeated, the name tasting like ash. "What is it?" "It is not a research facility, ma'am. It is a place. A very private, very discreet, high-security, long-term care facility. It is located in a remote, heavily wooded mountain area, miles from any town. It is, by all accounts, a place for people to be forgotten." Margaret's blood ran cold. Her mind was racing, trying to outrun the horrifying conclusion that was forming. She was almost afraid to ask the next question. "Who owns it? Who is the proprietor of this place?" "It was buried deep, ma'am, behind 3 shell corporations and 2 offshore accounts. But I found him, the sole proprietor, founder, and chief physician of the sanctuary." Margaret held her breath. "Is a man named Dr. Alistair Finch." The name, the atmosphere in the study, already suffocating, became explosive. It was a detonation in the silence. The name from the forged document Clara had found. The 2 parallel investigations, Margaret's and the Waitress's, which had begun worlds apart, had just converged with terrifying, sickening precision on this single, dark, unknown man. The trap was real. Margaret did not wait. The morning sun had barely crested the high, imposing walls of the Blackwood estate when she began her maneuvers. She had Harrison retrieve Clara from her apartment under the cover of darkness, a silent, secure extraction, and brought her to the house. The girl was terrified, but clutched her worn bag as if it were a shield. Margaret saw the journal and the legal papers and knew her next move was final. She then called Julian, her voice a masterful, convincing imitation of the fragile, grieving, and slightly hysterical woman he believed her to be. "Julian, darling." She had cooed into the phone, her voice trembling with practiced weakness. "I am having a terrible, terrible crisis of confidence. About the fund, the numbers you showed me. They just don't make sense to my old mind. We must have an emergency family meeting, this afternoon. Just us. Please, I need you to explain it all to me one more time. Julian." With a long-suffering sigh she could practically hear over the line, had agreed, no doubt annoyed by the disruption, but supremely confident in his ability to manage his grieving, addled mother once more. He arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, striding into the formal, oppressive drawing room of the estate, a picture of polished, corporate confidence. The room, with its heavy silk curtains drawn against the afternoon light and its baronial fireplace, was always kept dark, a place for solemn, often grim, family announcements. "Mother," he began, his voice already laced with that patient, condescending tone he reserved just for her, a verbal pat on the head. "I truly hope this is important. I've moved 3 major calls for this." He stopped. The words died in his throat. His polished, $1,000,000 smile vanished, melting away as if it were a wax mask held too close to a fire. He froze, his briefcase still in hand. She was not alone. Standing near the fireplace, small, looking like a ghost in her simple dark clothes, was the waitress, Clara. She was visibly terrified, her knuckles white as she clutched her own bag, but she stood her ground, her eyes locked on him. She looked painfully out of place against the backdrop of ancestral portraits and priceless antiques, and she was standing next to his mother. Margaret herself was a revelation. She was not the frail, weeping woman he expected to find. She was seated in her high-backed wing chair, not as a patient, but as a queen on a throne. Her face was impassive as stone, her spine rigid, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, and utterly still. The trap was set. Julian's mind raced, his eyes darting between his mother, the girl, and the exit. This was impossible. This was a contained situation. He had handled this. "What?" he said, his voice no longer smooth, but a low, sharp, guttural sound. "Is she doing here?" He pointed at Clara, a quick, dismissive, angry gesture, as if she were a piece of garbage that had been tracked in. "Get her out, now. She is here as a witness, Julian." Margaret's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. It was a voice he had not heard in a decade, the voice of the matriarch. "Sit down." Julian, recovering a fraction of his composure, let out a short, incredulous, and utterly dismissive laugh. The sound was ugly and jarring in the deathly silent, elegant room. "A witness? Mother, have you lost your mind? A witness to what? This girl." He sneered. The word girl, dripping with contempt, is a pathetic, opportunistic liar, a common thief who saw a vulnerable, grieving old woman and decided to spin a fantasy. "She has poisoned your mind with her pathetic, transparent little fairy tales, and you, in your grief, have let her." He took a step forward, his voice shifting, softening into the familiar, condescending tone of concern he had perfected over the last 10 years. "Mother, I know you've been unwell, but this is a new low. Allowing this, waitress, to dredge up the past and desecrate Amelia's memory for a quick payout? It's vulgar. Now I am going to have her removed, and you and I will have a long talk about your judgment." He was walking toward Clara now, his face a mask of cold fury, reaching for her arm as if to physically drag her from the room. But before he could touch her, Clara, who had been shaking, her whole body trembling with a visible, palpable terror, took a single, defiant step forward. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was so firm, so filled with a sudden righteous power that it stopped him cold. Her hands, though trembling, were resolute. She opened her tote bag, which had seemed so cheap and out of place, and pulled out 2 items. First, the worn, green leather journal. She placed it on the polished antique mahogany table between them. The book landed with a heavy, soft, accusing thud that seemed to echo in the profound silence. Second, she pulled out the folded, official-looking legal papers. She laid them carefully beside the book. She wrote this. Clara said, her voice gaining strength. Her eyes filled with tears, locked on his. "My mother, Amelia, she wrote how you trapped her. How you told her she was sick, that she was confused. How you isolated her and brought your doctor. She wrote how she was afraid of you." Julian stared at the items, a flicker of genuine, unbridled panic in his eyes. But he recovered instantly, his laugh louder this time, though it sounded brittle, thin, and desperate. "Forgeries," he spat. "Pathetic, obvious forgeries. You think this will work? You think anyone will believe this? My sister was a deeply troubled woman." "This proves nothing." "I believe it," Margaret Blackwood said. Her voice, cold and final, cut him off. Julian stopped, his mouth open, turning to his mother. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were lethal. "I believe it, Julian, because it seems your Dr. Finch is a very busy man." "It proves nothing because there is nothing to prove," Julian spat, his voice a low, vicious snarl. He finally looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a terrifying cold pity. "She is dead. I grieved her. We grieved her. And this street rat's pathetic attempt at His tirade was cut short by the quiet, heavy sound of the main drawing-room door opening. A man in a simple, perfectly tailored dark suit stepped into the room. He was nondescript, calm, and held a thin, black, leather-bound folder. Julian stared at him, his panic escalating into pure, unadulterated rage. "Who are you? Mother, what is this circus? Get these people out of my home. This is Mr. Harrison," Margaret said, her voice a dead, flat calm, "my head of personal security. He has been looking into the charitable fund." Harrison took a single, measured step forward, opening the folder. His voice was as flat and unemotional as a legal affidavit. "Mr. Blackwood, my investigation has confirmed your systematic, decade-long embezzlement from the Blackwood Charitable Fund. Millions were diverted to a holding company, Sanctuary Holdings, LLC. Julian's face was white. It was a private donation, a research grant, for palliative care. "For my sister's memory." "No, sir," Harrison continued, his eyes never leaving Julian's. "The sanctuary is not a hospice. It is not a research facility. It is a high-security, involuntary lockdown facility in the northern mountains. It specializes in discrete family problems for high-net-worth clients." The air in the room was so thin, Clara felt she would faint. "Lies," Julian roared. "All lies." Harrison turned one page in his folder. "We cross-referenced the admission date on Dr. Finch's forged document. The facility's private records, which we obtained under court order, show one Jane Doe was admitted on that exact date, March 10th, 10 years ago. A full psychiatric hold order signed by Dr. Finch and funded by your private trust. We obtained a visual confirmation this morning." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She knew. "No," she whispered. "Oh God, no." Harrison looked at her, his professional mask softening for just a second with something like pity. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice the final, world-shattering blow. "Your daughter, Amelia, is alive. She is a prisoner. She has been there, heavily medicated, for 10 years. The sound that ripped from Margaret's throat was not a word. It was a visceral, agonized cry of a pain so profound it was inhuman. The control finally broke. As his mother collapsed into a fit of desperate, broken sobs, Julian, his face a mask of pure, feral hate, lunged. He was not going for Clara. He was going for Harrison, for the report, screaming, "You lie, you all lie." Before he could take 2 steps, 2 uniformed security men, who had been standing silently outside the door, entered, grabbing his arms and restraining him with practiced, brutal efficiency. The lie was not just exposed, it was annihilated. The aftermath was swift and brutal, a corporate and social detonation. Julian, screaming incoherently about lies and his mother's incompetence, was unceremoniously removed from the formal drawing room by the uniformed security. They handed him over to the state police. Harrison had discreetly waiting at the estate's main gates. His arrest for kidnapping, fraud, and false imprisonment was the smallest part of the news that would rock the city. The real war, Margaret's war, began. Margaret Blackwood, a woman reborn in ice and a righteous, terrifying fury, descended upon the sanctuary that very afternoon. She arrived not as a grieving mother, but as a general, armed with a battery of the state's best lawyers, private medical specialists, and an emergency court order that shattered the facility's discreet, fortress-like walls. The facility, and the now panicked Dr. Finch, folded instantly under the legal, financial, and personal onslaught. The reunion, however, was not a moment of cinematic, tearful joy. It was a scene of profound, quiet, agonizing trauma. The woman Margaret and Clara found in that sterile, white, sunless room was not the vibrant, rebellious Amelia from Margaret's memory, nor the sad-eyed mother from Clara's. She was a ghost. A frail, heartbreakingly thin woman with vacant, haunted eyes, kept in a thick, chemical fog for 10 long years. She was frail, heavily medicated, and she barely recognized the world, flinching from light and sound. When Margaret, her iron control finally shattering into a million pieces, collapsed by the bedside, sobbing, and tried to embrace her, Amelia flinched, a decade of programmed fear in the simple, heart-breaking movement. But then Clara stepped forward, not as a stranger, not as a granddaughter, but as the nurse she was trained to be. She spoke softly, her voice calm and steady, and she slowly, gently, held up her wrist. The silver key charm. Amelia's eyes, previously dull and unfocused, flickered. A single, agonizing spark of recognition in the void. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the familiar, worn silver. "My key," she whispered, her voice a dry, unused rasp. That was the moment the long, painful healing began. In the following weeks, Clara's new life solidified. She didn't just move into the Blackwood estate. She transformed an entire wing of it into a state-of-the-art private recovery suite. Her nursing skills, once a means to pay for textbooks, were now her mother's lifeline. She was no longer a waitress. She was a full-time caregiver and, undeniably, a granddaughter. Margaret, horrified by her own blindness and the decade she had lost, poured every ounce of her vast resources into her daughter's slow, painful recovery. The two women, grandmother and granddaughter, formed a silent, unbreakable bond over Amelia's bedside. "You saved us both," Margaret said to Clara one quiet evening, her hand resting on Clara's, her eyes on her sleeping daughter. The silver key charm, once a symbol of a lost, buried past, had done its job. It had unlocked the darkest, most painful secret imaginable, and now it was the key to a fragile, new, and shared future. If this story of a locked-away truth and a mother's unbreakable bond held your attention, please show your support with a thumbs up and a comment below. Your engagement is what makes it possible for us to bring these complex, emotional journeys to life. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss another story of truth discovered. And please, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that no secret, no matter how deep it's buried or how powerfully it's guarded, can stay hidden forever. The truth always finds a way to fight for the light. Thank you for listening.